We continue now at the top of Daf Dalet Amud Beis in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 4b. On the previous Amud, Rav said that the Minchas HaOmer, since it comes to permit the new grain, therefore if it's done Shelo Lishma, if the fistful, the kometz is taken Shelo Lishma, it will be psul, it will be disqualified. Since it's not being matir, it's not permitting the new grain, it is not going to be kosher as well. And the Gemara continued and said the same is true by Asham of a Nazir, because the Asham of a Nazir, that allows the beginning of the counting of the Nazirus of Tara, of the days of purity, of the Nazir. And the statement continues, V'asham mitzora, it's also true by an Asham of a mitzora, sheshachtan shelo lishman. Again, both of those, the Asham Nazir and the Asham mitzora that are slaughtered, shelo lishman, pesulin, they are going to be disqualified, hoel ubo lahachshir, since the purpose is to render the individual fit, v'lo hechshiro, and they don't render him fit, therefore they are disqualified. And Rashi explains, Asham Mitzora Bahu Lahachshiro Laval B'machana. The Asham of a Mitzora renders him fit to enter the camp. Well, the Kamon Parach. Now the Gemara later will ask, Shara Ashamos Nami. This is true by all carbon Ashams. Bahu L'chaper. Aren't they coming as an atonement? V'lo Kipro, and they don't provide that atonement if it's Shelo Lishma. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Kol ha-menachos shenikmetzu shelo lishman kasheros, all carbon minchas where the kometz is taken shelo lishman, they're kosher, ela shelo alu l'baylim l'shem chova, but they don't satisfy the obligation of the owner, chutz mi minchas chote u minchas kenos, with the exception of minchas chote and the minchas kenos, the mincha of the sota, those are not kosher if they're shelo lishma. And so the Gemara says, Vim Isa, if it's true what Rav said, listening nami chutz mi minchas ha'omer, the Mishnah should also say, with the exception of minchas ha'omer, that also is disqualified if it's shelo lishma. And the Gemara says, Ki katani, what is the Mishnah listing? It's listing ba yachid if it's brought by an individual. Ba tzibor lo katani, it's not listing something brought by the community. The minchas ha'omer is brought by the community. That's the only reason it's not in the Mishnah. Kitani ba biglal atzma, also in the Mishnah it's only cases of minchas that come on their own. Ba biglal zevach lo katani, if it's coming together with an animal that is slaughtered as a carbon, that's not listed in the Mishnah. And ki katani hanach shein kavua lehen zman, also in the Mishnah it's only cases of mincha where there's had kavua lazman, but the minchas ha'omer where there's a set time lo katani, that is not listed in the Mishnah. And Rashi explains, Biglal zevach, if it's coming with a carbon, im ha-zevach, meaning it's coming again with a slaughtered animal as a carbon, to minchas ha'omer ba im ha-keves, the minchas ha'omer comes together with a sheep. The chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, v'asisem biyom ha-nifchem es ha'omer, it says again, you're going to do it on the day you wave the omer, and then the kavua lozman, again, there's a set time b'Nisan, there's a set time in the month of Nisan. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, we just said above, v'cheinat ha'omer ba'asham nazir v'asham mitzora, the same is true by asham nazir and asham mitzora, shachtan shelo lishman, if they're slaughtered shelo lishman psulin, they are disqualified. Hoel uvo lahachshav v'lo hechshiro, since again those are in order to render the individual fit. If they're not rendering the individual fit, then they are pasul, they are disqualified. And the Gemara says, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah Meseches zvachim, kol hazvachim sheshachtan shelo lishman ksherin, all slaughtered karbonos which are slaughtered shelo lishman are kosher. Ela shelo alu l'baylim l'shem chova, but they don't satisfy the obligation of the owner. Chutz mi pesach v'chatos, with the exception of carbon pesach and carbon chatos. There, if it's shelo lishman, it will be disqualified. And so the Gemara asks, Vim Isa, now if it's true, what we Asham Nazir, Asham Mitzora are also disqualified. So listening nami, chutz me Asham Nazir, Asham Mitzora, the Mishnah should also say, with the exception of Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora, debo lahachshir v'lo hechshiru, they come in order to render one fit, and if they don't render the person fit, they're disqualified. They should also be mentioned in the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues and answers, Kevan di'iko Asham gezelos v'Asham me'ilos, since there are other kinds of carbon Asham gezelos, asham me'ilos, the lechapara asu, those come for an atonement. They don't come lahachshir, they don't come to render somebody fit. They come for an atonement, and therefore those are not disqualified. So lo psikole, it's not true across the board by carbon asham, and that's why asham is not mentioned in that Mishnah, but it is true that asham nazir and asham mitzora are in fact exceptions. The Gemara says, Ma'ishna asham nazir v'asham mitzora, but what's really the difference between asham nazir and asham mitzora? Debo lahachshir v'lo hechshiro, they're meant to render one fit, and they haven't rendered the person fit. But haninami, when it comes to asham gezelos, asham me'ilos, that's bo lechapara. They have a purpose also. Their purpose is to atone. V'lo kipro, and if it's shelo lishma, they haven't fulfilled that. They haven't created that atonement, and so therefore they also should be disqualified. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Rav Yirmiyah says, Matzinu shachilek hakasa bein mechaprim uvein machshir, and we already already find that the pasuk distinguishes between karbanos that are brought for atonement and karbanos that are brought in order to render the individual fit. And what difference do we find mechaprin when it comes to atonement? Ispahu da'asu la'achar misa. There are examples where it can even be brought after the individual's death. Machshirim, but when it comes to rendering fit, lesbahu da'asu la'achar misa. We don't find examples where it can be brought after death, and therefore once we find that difference, we can make this difference, this distinction as well. And the Gemara continues, the Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, ha'isha shehivia chatas of a mesa. Let's say a woman brings her carbon chatas and she dies, yaviu yarshin olasa, then her heirs are allowed to bring her carbon ola, olasa of a mesa, but if she brought her ola already and then she died, lo yaviu yarshin chatasa, then the heirs do not bring her carbon chatas. And Rashi explains, Matzino Shachilek, we find the distinction between Machshirim and Mechaprin, Uve Machshirim Hechmiru, and when it comes to Machshirim, they are more strict. And then the Gemara brought the Mishnah Meseches Kinim, this is talking about a woman after childbirth. So Lo Yaviu Yarshin Chatos, if she dies, she brought, let's say, the Ola already, the Yarshim do not bring her Chatos. Tezu Achas Mechomesh Chatos HaMesos, this is one of the 5 Chatos which are left to die. Chatos Shemesu Ba'aleh, this is a Chatos where the owner has died. And Rashi explains, V'chatos Yoledes Machshiru. Now this stringency by the Chatos of a woman who gave birth is actually a Machshir. It's not a Mechaper, it's a Machshir. It renders her fit. Kedaminan Bekrisus Beperak Dam Shchita. We say this in Krisus. Mibnei Shemachsharta Lechol Bekotshim. It allows her to eat Kodshim. Umida Chatos Lahachshir, from the fact that her Chatos is to render her fit. Olasa Lechaper. It's actually her Ola. And Kedechsev Bioledes Echad Lechatos Viechad Liola. Like it says by Oledes, one for a Chatos and one for an Ola. Alma. So again, we see Mechaper and Karvi, the atonement that is offered, meaning after death, and Machshir and Lo Karvi, the Machshir, are not offered after death. And so Hachanami will say the same thing over here. Mechaprin b'shalol lishmon ksherin lahakriv. By Mechaprin, if it's shalol lishmon, it's still going to be kosher to offer that carbon. V'lo olu, they won't satisfy the obligation of the owner, but they will be kosher. Umachshirin, but if it's a Machshirin, psulin legamri, then it will be totally disqualified. But the Gemara continues, Maskef la Rav Yehuda Bered Rav Shimon ben Pazi. Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shimon ben Pazi, asks the following question: Machshirin nami, when it comes to Machshirin as well, mi les behu da'asul achar misa, do we have no examples where they're brought after the person's death? V'atanan, but we learned in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah Meseches Me'ilah, hamafresh mos l'niziruso, if somebody separates money for his nizirus, lo nanin v'lo moalin, the person shouldn't get benefit from the money, but there is no me'ilah by that money. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Mipnei lavo kulan shlamim, because it's fit that all of that can be used for carbon shlamim. Mace, if the individual dies, v'hayu lo mos stuman, and there's money and it wasn't specifically designated, yiplu l'nedava, then it falls to donation. Mefurashin, if it was designated, so then demechatos, whatever money was designated for the carbon chatos, yolech liyam hamelach, that goes to the Dead Sea. Lo nanin v'lo moel, and again one shouldn't get benefit, but there's no me'ilah. Demei ola, any money that was designated for ola, yavi bohen ola, the ola should be brought. Moalin bohen, and there is me'ilah. Demei shlamim, any money for shlamim, yavi bohen shlamim, the shlamim is brought. V'necholin liyomechon, and it's eaten for one day. Ve'ein tu'un in lechem, there's no requirement of loaves. And so the Gemara asks, va'ola u'shlamim, the nazir, when it comes to the ola and the shlamim of a nazir, the machshirim ninu, those are considered karbanos that are meant to render the individual fit. V'ka'asu la'achar misa, and they are being brought after the person's death. So we do have an example of machshirin that are brought li'achar misa. And Rashi explains, again, the money designated by a nazir, lo nanin midrabanan, one shouldn't derive benefit from that money on a drabanan level, mipnei demei ola shabehen, because that money includes the value for the carbon ola that needs to be brought by the nazir. However, v'lo moalin, but there is no me'ilah, mipnei sheru'uyin lavo l'shlamim, because it could be that money will be used for the shlamim. Hoel v'lo hifresh elu l'chatos ve'elu l'shlamim, since he didn't specifically say this money is for the chatos and this money is for the shlamim, u'shlamim ein bohen me'ilah, and shlamim, there is no me'ilah by shlamim. The lav kodshe Hashem ninu, that's not considered kodshim that belongs to Hashem, ela mamun bailam, it's considered that it belongs to the owner. Ela be'imurim la'achar zrikas damim, with the exception of the sacrificial portions after the throwing of the blood, there, that is kodshe Hashem, those emurim, so there's me'ilah just by those emurim. Beparakama de Meseches me'ilah, this is all in the first parak of Meseches me'ilah. And then the Mishnah said that if the Nazir died and there was stumin, there was money that wasn't specifically designated, the lo perish elu lechatas ve'elu l'ola, didn't say that this money is for chatas and this money is for ola. So then yiplu l'nedava, then it just falls to donation l'shofaros, to those shofaros. Those again are the containers that contain the money of donation for the Beis Hamikdash. The halachi ben Nazir l'Moshe Messina, that's halach l'Moshe Messina by Nazir. V'chein mefarish ben Nazir beperak misha amar hareini Nazir v'shama chavero. That's also explained in Nazir. And again, yolech liyam hamelech, when it comes to any money that is specified, if it's specified for a chatas, it goes to the Yam HaMelech, kedin chatas shemesu ba'aleh. That's like any chatas where the owner died, the lamisa azla, it is left to die, so it's yolech liyam HaMelech. And Rashi continues, by the Dmei Chatas lo nenin midrabanan, again, one shouldn't derive benefit from that money on a derabanan level, v'lo mo'alin, but there's no me'ila with that money on a doraisa level. Person's not liable for me'ila if he does use it for personal use. Da'amar b'shmaita kamaisa de'me'ila, because we say in the first sugya in Meseches me'ila, chatos ha-mesos. If you have chatos that are supposed to be left to die, umos ha-holchos liyam ha-melech, or the money that's supposed to go liyam ha-melech, ein mo'alin b'hen, there is no me'ila with those, the le'ibad kaimi, because they're meant to be destroyed anyhow. Kodshe Gavoa Ninu. So again, they don't have the status of Kodshe Gavoa. And then we said Demei Shlamim, the money that's designated for Shlamim, you can bring a Shlamim. Avol Demei Asham Leka. Rashi says there is no Demei Asham. De'eno B'Nazir Tar Ela B'Nazir Tameh. When it comes to Asham, that doesn't apply by a Nazir who's Tar, who's pure. It only applies by a Nazir who's Tameh. And in any case, again, the question of the Gemara was that by Ola and Shlamim, it says, you Yavi Bahen Shlamim, you bring with them a carbon Shlamim, Yavi Bahen Ola, you bring the carbon Ola. And so the Gemara again asked that Ola and Shlamim of a Nazir are Machshirim Ninu, those are meant to render fit. The Ka'asul Achar Misa, you say they are being brought after death. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Papa says, Hachi Kamar Rav Yirmiyah, this is what Rav Yirmiyah was saying, Lo Matzino Hechsher Kavua de Bal Achar Misa. We don't find the Hechsher Kavua that comes La Achar Misa, meaning where it's clear that this particular carbon is the machshir, that doesn't come la'achar misa. U'de nazir, babayan nazir hechsher she'eno kavua, who it's actually in the category of hechsher she'eno kavua. It's not a fixed hechsher, as the Gemara will explain, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Hey Amud Aleph.